Our scripture today comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. It's printed in the bulletin if you'd like to read along. If not, you can just listen. Let's hear the word. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she put a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. May God add blessing and understanding to the hearing of this word. In the Bible, there are lots of famous births. We might even remember a couple from our last sermon series a month ago or so, just really a few weeks ago, on Jacob. Before Jacob, we had Isaac, who was born to Abraham and Sarah, and he wasn't supposed to be born because Sarah was 90, and Abraham was 100. And then, even after that, we had the birth of the twins, Jacob and Esau, to Isaac and Rebekah. And nothing really outstanding about that birth, except that the older was being drugged back by the younger, and that was significant because Jacob ended up with a promise, and he ended up with a blessing like the older child should have had. And so he was trying from his birth on to gain that, which he did, and God blessed him. We have the story of Moses, and we'll discuss a little bit more about that. But even before the birth of Jesus, we had the birth of John the Baptist. Again, to old parents. Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah was so amazed by the fact that he was going to be a father because he'd been fatherless so long. He was made mute for disbelieving. That's hard for a preacher. He worked in the temple. He was a rabbi, and he could not speak until after the birth of his son. And of course, the most famous birth of all, Jesus. The one that has people that question it all the time because it seems so unbelievable. I'm sure it's a great topic of conversation with you and your friends from time to time. Could it really have happened that way? We wonder. But that's part of the awe. That's part of the miracle of Christmas for us. That some very good things happen when they seem impossible. I've already mentioned that we had a baby just born in my family, beautiful Evie. She's so cute. But we've actually had 6 babies born in the last 4 years. My niece and nephew and their husband and wife have been building their families, and it is wonderful. It's kind of nice to see a new generation coming up, and they're very close. The only problem they're going to have is that my niece and her husband root for Oklahoma, and my nephew and his wife root for Oklahoma State. We've already had them in cheerleading costumes and football uniforms. They get after it. Good thing that they love each other. This morning, we come and we try to understand this birth of one who is called to become the greatest prophet in the Israelite tradition. Moses, the one who will do great things. The one who will be trained to do great things that no one else could have done. So we come to understand this birth, and we try to understand then this understanding of what birth brings to our lives. Sometimes it's newness, sometimes it's renewedness. And so we come this morning to try to think of these things. When we last left the scriptures, we were finishing up that Jacob story, and we got all the way to where Jacob had come back to his brother Esau. And from that point on to where we get to the Moses story, there is a ton of stuff that happens. There is a ton of stuff that happens. Jacob will have a 12th son, Benjamin, from his beautiful bride, Rachel, his favorite wife. And that will give him then 12 sons between his 2 wives and their maids that were given to him so that he could have more children. You will understand that that is significant because those 12 sons become the names of the tribes of all the people of Israel. When our scripture this morning says that Moses was born into the Levite tribe. Well, Levi was one of the sons of Jacob. And so when all of these cousins got together, they could figure out who belonged to whom by saying, whose tribe are you? Well, Moses is from the tribe of Levi. During that time of the building of his own family, Jacob had a special son. He had one that he loved more than anybody else. You may remember the play more than you remember the story, or maybe you remember the story as well as you remember the play. Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph is the special child, and he has a special gift. Do you remember that? That he had a special gift? He could interpret dreams. He could interpret dreams. It was his gift from God. And he had dreams, and he interpreted them, and he shared them with his brothers, and his brothers hated him for it. Literally hated him for it. They sold him into slavery. He was taken to Egypt, where he was put into work, and then thrown into prison for a wrong purpose. Not the story we're going to focus on, so we're not going to worry about that story right now. He was put into prison, where he was able to interpret dreams. Someone whom he interpreted a dream for told the king, Pharaoh, I know this guy. He comes and he interprets dreams that Pharaoh was having that were struggle for him, and he needed to know the answers, and he knew it was something spiritual, and here comes this Joseph, and he interprets the dreams, and he saves all of Egypt. Over the course of saving Egypt, he's made second in command. He's not even Egyptian, and he's second in command because he can understand and interpret what needed to happen for not just that country, not just Egypt, but for the whole area around. He saved them all from famine. His brothers are experiencing that famine with their father, and they come to Egypt to get some food because they've run out where they live. And he recognizes them. And he was as mean to them as they were to him. But eventually, he reveals himself to his brothers. And they all move. All the family of Jacob, who's now been renamed Israel. Does that sound familiar? Jacob Israel moves his whole family to Egypt. And Pharaoh, who is still so happy about what has happened in the life of his country, says, hey, Joseph, bring your family and let them live here. Where they live is the best of the best. They live in the best part of Egypt, the best place to farm, the best place to raise your animals. There's more water there and more green fields there. And so that's where they live, generation after generation after generation after generation after generation. And God blesses them, and they multiply, and they multiply, and they grow, and so do the farm animals, because that's how much God has blessed them. When we start in the book of Exodus, we hear that a new Pharaoh has come to town. And this Pharaoh knows nothing of Joseph. I kind of question that. Because, these are the guys who would have been the most educated people in their whole country. How could they not read the history well? How could they not have been taught that there was this famine and there was this man? This Pharaoh, according to the text that we have, says that he had no idea who Joseph was. And this group of people who weren't even Egyptian were living in the best part. And they were huge. And he was afraid. He was afraid that they would either form their own army or join with another enemy and defeat the Egyptian people. So he enslaved them. And that's where we pick up the story today. In the middle of this enslavement, he has said to the midwives, they are too big. We need to control the population. So any male child that is born, kill it. Any male child, but the midwives wouldn't do it. Midwives, they bring life in, they don't take life out. And so they refused to do it. And when Pharaoh confronted them, they said, well, these Hebrew women are hardy. They're not like Egyptian women. They have their babies before the midwife even gets there. That's how they covered their tracks. And so, Moses is born, and he's a good child, and his mom wants to protect him. She does everything that she can for 3 months, but after 3 months, it's too much. She can't hide him anymore, so she basically makes him a little raft out of a basket. She puts him in the Nile River. And where our story ended today, his sister watches him float down the river. Well, he floated to a really good spot. He floated to the bathing spot of the princess, Pharaoh's daughter. And while she's there, she sees this and she sends a servant to go and get it. They bring the basket over and she's like, oh, this must be one of the Hebrew children. When it's clear that she's going to keep the child, to raise as her own son, even though he is Hebrew, and even though he should be killed. Moses' sister, whom we don't know her name at this point, but we know it's Miriam, runs up and says, you're going to keep this kid. Would you like someone to come, would you like someone to nurse the child? And so she brings her mother. They meet, and the princess says, you take care of this child. I will give you your wages. This is your work for now. And so Moses goes home, a short little trip down the river. Then he gets to go home and be with his family until that time when he is weaned. Do you think his mom held on a little longer than she should have? And so he goes to live in the palace. This is the birth process for Moses. This is how his life comes into being. This is how he remains alive when so many were put to death. He's fortunate, and yet he's going to have a calling. He's going to have a calling. I think there are lots of questions we could ask of this particular passage. Why did the princess choose to keep him? Why did she do that? What is it that God has in store? Well, we can know that if we know and go ahead in the story. One of the main questions that I have is, did other people in the palace, surely they had to know, right? They had to know that she had adopted a child because she hadn't been pregnant. So why was that okay? Or was it just her servants that knew and she was able to hide for 6 months or 9 months? And did others in the palace know? See, I think it's always unclear in this Moses story whether he knew that he was Hebrew from the time he was a little kid, or if he came into that awareness. We'll talk about this as we go through this, because this is a 4-week study, so we'll talk about this a little more as we go through this. But I always question that. If he didn't know, then it was a shock when he found out as an adult. But how did other people in the palace treat him? Did they know or did they not know? And we don't have answers to these questions. Why she adopted? If others knew. But I think they're interesting questions to ask. Now, all along the process, when it comes to having a kid, and I'm not an expert in this area, which many of you already know that, but there are pains. The birth process is not always positive. Well, let me rephrase that. That's not the word I want. It's not always easy. How about that? My family knows that. You've asked questions, we've shared that. Thank you for your prayers. Sometimes there are concerns, even when the birthing process, when being a parent for the first time is starting to happen for you, there are lots of doubts. There are lots of questions. Am I going to be up to this? Can I really take care? Am I going to be a good father? Am I going to be a good mother? There are lots of questions. There are lots of questions. And women in the room who have had children, will you understand birth pains better than anybody else? It is not always a pain-free process. It is not always a struggle-free process. But we forget those pains when this new life comes into our arms. Right? We forget them. The questions may still be there, but they go away too with each day. Because this child comes. and represents so much. Hope, goodness, joy. We have so much expectation for the life that is in our midst. Do you remember a movie, Father of the Bride? Do you remember the sequel? Aptly named Father of the Bride Part 2. That was such a funny show because we have this man who's dreaming of a day when he can sell his company and retire. His firstborn, his daughter, has been married, and she comes and announces that she's pregnant. And not only is she pregnant, but she might be moving away. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've seen the movie. And in the process of all of that, he learns, he thinks, well, I'm old enough to retire, but I'm not ready to be a grandpa. So he's having all these age issues. And then his wife comes to him and says, we're pregnant. Oops. He has to deal with becoming a grandfather and a father almost in the same exact moment. And in fact, part of the craziness of the movie is that when his daughter goes into labor, so does his wife, and he's running back and forth between rooms, and it's Steve Martin and me. And so it's kind of this chaotic craziness, and in the midst of it all, you know what he does? He comes to terms. He breathes. He lets go of that stress and that pressure. There's no attributing that to God in the movie, but for us, that would be where that peace and that letting go of stress can come from, is giving it over to God. But he comes into this awareness that what is going to be in his arms is full of hope, will bring him so much love, and he will have so much good expectation. He was only thinking of all the negative before. But he comes into it and says, we get that. For whether you've had your own child or not, you've seen the goodness that a baby brings. You know the hope and excitement that is there for those who are going to become parents. This birth brings so much. What's interesting to me is that a birth process is not only for people. Organizations go through them themselves, and maybe organizations that have been alive for a long time have rebirth. I think that we've been doing some of that ourselves over the last couple of years. I think we've birthed some new things. We have a new nursery. We're renovating upstairs. Maybe the renovation is more of a rebirth. We created a fall festival. That was amazing, and we're getting ready to do our second one, and it's going to take everybody in this room to make that successful. But do you remember what that was like for us? Do you remember what energy came to us from offering ourselves to the community and saying, hey, come and enjoy yourselves on our property? So much going on with renovations. If you haven't stuck your head in, the plaster has started. We're moving forward. We know when our sound guy is going to come. We know when our wood guy is going to come. Things are moving forward. And aren't you hopeful? Aren't you expectant? I am. This birth and rebirth process is something that happens for organizations as well as individuals. We think of it in a spiritual sense because we know that the idea of birth and rebirth is in the Bible. Jesus will say some things, Paul will say some things about being born again. I don't know for you, I think that we probably have a variety of feelings. Baptized, or that day of making a confession of faith, that was when you were born into your faith. That could be, for some, it could just be being born into your family and being raised in a family of faith. Maybe that's where you were born. There are some in the world on the evangelical side of life that believe that you have to be able to pinpoint a specific day and time and place where you were overwhelmed by the Spirit, and they call that being born again, a rebirth. Some people just believe that God has been nurturing them all along the way in gentle and subtle ways. Nothing wrong with either process, and I believe in both. But that misses the point for me. That misses the point for me just a little. In my mind, this birth process or this rebirth process when it comes to the way of the Spirit doesn't just happen one time. In a huge, magnanimous way, I believe it happens every day. Every day that we wake up and we say, God, how can I serve you today? Every day when we wake up and we say, I'm alive, what can I do for you today, God? How can I say yes in my faith today? I believe this birth process is not something that happens one time and we go. It is an opportunity to commit ourselves to the one who is so committed to us. It is an opportunity to live in such a way that others in this community can come to know God through the way that we live. I'm not talking that you need to go up and talk to someone and say, do you believe in God? Have you been born? Have you da-da-da? That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying simply by the way you live in this world, others can come to know of your faithfulness. And that happens every day. So the rebirth process for us is just waking up. Waking up to the goodness and the expectation of the day. Just waking up to knowing that God is with us. No matter what trial comes, Moses is going to know that. It's going to take a pretty miraculous event, but he's going to know that God has been with him and shaping him for a certain cause. It's a good thing. Rob Bell tells a story about being on a family vacation when he was in high school, and while they were at this vacation, they decided to go to church. So they went to church. They went through everything, they got to the end, and there was kind of a call to faith, a little differently than the way we do it. The minister stood in front of everybody and said, everybody, I want you to shut your eyes. Everybody, shut your eyes. You don't have to right now. And he said, if you have not committed yourself to Christ, if you've not committed yourself to faith, I want you to repeat a prayer that I'm going to pray right now. And he prayed with the people. And then at the end of the prayer he said, now if you were one of those who prayed, now remember, every eye is shut. No one will know. I want you to raise your hand. I see you, sir, in the back. Oh, you young women in the front, I see your hands. That's wonderful. Oh, yes, right there in the third. Started pointing out the people. But everybody's eyes weren't closed. Rob was looking around. And as this minister was standing up in front, pointing out people, he knew that no one that day had raised their hand. A few years later, he and his father were having a conversation about that day at church on vacation. And his dad said, I didn't shut my eyes either. He said, but I wasn't looking around, Rob. I was looking at you. I was watching you, looking at your face, knowing what was going on, and I was so sure. I was so sure that we'd lost you. In my mind, I was just saying, we just lost Rob. He's never going to want to come to church. He's never want to continue his faith process. We've lost Rob. In his book called Velvet, Elvis, so you know it's good, he writes these words, speaking about himself. I am like you. I have seen plenty done in the name of God that I'm sure God doesn't want anything to do with. I have lots of reasons for bailing on the whole thing. I am like you because I have a choice to become bitter, cynical, jaded, and hard. Anybody can do that. A lot have. Hatred is a powerful, unifying force, and there is a lot to be repulsed by. or like you. I can choose to reclaim my innocence. We can choose to reclaim our innocence together. We can insist that hope is real and that a group of people who love God and others really can change the world. We can reclaim our idealism and our belief and our confidence in the big ideas that stir us deep in our bones. We can commit all the more to being the kinds of people who are learning how to do what Jesus teaches us. And my friends, in the way that I understand this faith thing, that happens every day. So good morning, and happy birthday. Have high expectations. Share love and faith. May it be so this day. Amen.